Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Section 1. And we're going to delve into the causes of the American Civil War, the most tragic conflict and the most deadly conflict that we've ever been involved in. And we need to first discuss the divisive politics of slavery. This issue was the number one hot topic, the number one divisive topic that our nation was polarizing about. Northern people generally disliked slavery. Southern people considered it a sacred institution generally. Yet though we've talked about how it was mostly wealthy Southern planters who were able to afford slaves. But their voice did carry the loudest because they were often the ones influencing politics and government at that time.
The struggle over slavery began in the early 1800s, when the southern slave states and the northern free states developed very different economies and cultures. The North created an industrial economy, while the South depended on agriculture. The growth of the textile industry in the North and in Europe led to an increased demand for cotton. Slavery became even more important to Southerners, who needed the cheap labor to grow and harvest more cotton. To them, slaves were an essential part of the economy. Some Northerners felt slavery was immoral. Slave owners had complete control over the lives of enslaved African Americans. Over time, the question of the spread of slavery to the territories of the United States became an issue of growing importance. It first arose in 1819, when Missouri, where slavery was legal, asked to be admitted as a new state. Henry Clay of Kentucky persuaded Congress to pass the Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery from territories north of Missouri's southern border. It also allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, and Maine to enter as a free state. This kept the number of free and slave states the same, so the two regions, the North and the South, would have the same number of senators. Meanwhile, reformers called abolitionists began to push for the end of slavery. In 1831, abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison began publishing a newspaper called The Liberator. Frederick Douglass also began an anti-slavery newspaper. Douglass was a former slave who had escaped to the North. He gave many speeches describing the cruelty of slavery to win support for the anti-slavery movement. Some abolitionists took more direct action. They formed a network called the Underground Railroad to help enslaved African Americans escape from the South and reach free states in the North or Canada. Thomas Garrett of Delaware was one of the most active people in this network. He helped nearly 3,000 of the enslaved escape to freedom. But white abolitionists were not the only people working on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, who had herself escaped slavery, made many trips to the South to help other enslaved African Americans escape. Slavery became a more pressing issue during the Mexican War, when Congressman David Wilmot proposed banning slavery from any land obtained from Mexico. In 1850, California applied to enter the Union as a free state. This raised a problem because admitting it would cause an imbalance of free and slave states in the Senate. In response, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850. It allowed California's entry as a free state, but dictated that other territories acquired from Mexico could choose on their own whether to be free or slave states. This option to choose was known as popular sovereignty. The Compromise of 1850 included another law, the Fugitive Slave Act. This act required both Northerners and Southerners to help recapture escaped enslaved African Americans. Many Northerners refused to obey this law. Anger over the law and over slavery spurred abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe to write an important book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her novel told of the brutality of slavery, symbolized by the fate of the slave Uncle Tom. A kindly and Christian man, Tom was beaten to death by the overseer hired by his master. The book, which clearly illustrated the injustices of slavery, became a bestseller in the North. Prior to its publication, many Northerners were indifferent about slavery. After reading the book, many people became outraged over slavery. To Southerners, though, Uncle Tom's Cabin was false and an attack on their way of life. The next step in the growing fight over slavery came in 1854, when Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act organized the new Nebraska and Kansas territories and gave the residents in both areas the right to decide whether or not to allow slavery. Both pro- and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, hoping to have enough voters to determine the area's laws on slavery. By 1856, Kansas had two governments, one pro-slavery and one anti-slavery. Members of the two sides fought each other, and people began to call the area Bleeding Kansas. In the wake of this violence, the new Republican Party was formed. The Republicans were against the spread of slavery into the Western territories. In the 1856 election, the Republicans ran John C. Fremont for president. Though Fremont lost to Democrat James Buchanan, Republican views on slavery began to gain wider acceptance in the North. In 1857, the Supreme Court decided the important case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. The court ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery from territories. The decision was celebrated in the South, but viewed angrily in the North. In 1858, Stephen Douglas, the proponent of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was challenged by Republican Abraham Lincoln in the race for Senator of Illinois. During their debates, Lincoln firmly declared the Republican goal of blocking the spread of slavery. Lincoln did not win the election, but his name became known to many Americans. Tensions between the sides grew in 1859, when a white abolitionist named John Brown tried to spark a slave revolt in Virginia. After Brown was captured, he was tried in Virginia for treason. He was executed and became a martyr in the eyes of his anti-slavery supporters. Those views angered many in the South, who had always feared a slave revolt. As the presidential election of 1860 approached, Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln as their candidate. Southerners threatened that if a Republican won the election, their states would secede or leave the Union. The Democratic Party split in two over the slavery issue. Northern Democrats named one nominee, and Southern Democrats picked another. By winning enough support in the North, Lincoln won the election. Many Southerners feared that Lincoln and his Republican supporters would move not just to ban slavery from the territories, but to end it in the South. As a result, people in South Carolina voted to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. 6 more states quickly followed. These states joined to form the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy created its own constitution, which guaranteed the protection of slavery. 4 more states would eventually leave the Union and join the Confederacy. Soon after, the North and South were plunged into a long and bitter civil war.
And so that clip served as an excellent preview for this chapter. We're going to be talking about over the next 4 days how only 83 years after our country's beginning, it fell apart. And as I've told you many times throughout this course, it's more common for countries to fall apart than it is for them to stay together. And yet, through such a terrible conflict, Abraham Lincoln did manage to preserve the Union, but at great cost. But in this chapter, we're going to be learning about what led us to that disunion, what led us to that tragedy. And of course, we've talked about sectionalism a lot in this course, how people began to think of themselves as Northerners or think of themselves as Southerners. And the North began to vote one way in elections, and the South was voting a different way. And some of the reasons for this that we've already explored. For example, by the 1850s, the North was largely industrialized. Most manufactured products were coming out of the northern United States. Most of the railroads in the country were in the northern part of the United States, carrying raw materials to the east. Manufacturers and settlers were also going west, but focusing their investment in the northern part of the country. Urbanization was already happening, meaning that cities were growing in size and population. Industry was growing. Investment, GDP, were growing in the north. Communication and infrastructure were growing. For example, telegraph wires were spreading all across the Northeast. Immigrants were coming in to the north in large numbers because that's where the job opportunities were. Not many people were coming into the South. largely because it would be difficult for new immigrants to compete with slave labor. And so the South's population remained somewhat stagnant while the North's population was growing exponentially. And let's contrast with the South. This is known as the antebellum period in Southern American history. The South was predominantly rural. Most people living in the South were farmers. Most people lived on either large plantations, if they were very wealthy, or rural farms, like most. The Southern economy relied almost entirely on cash crops. Agricultural commodities were the number one traded item in Southern markets. There were very few immigrants coming into the South at that time because generally immigrants were coming to the North because that's where the job opportunities were. Again, it would be difficult to compete with slave labor. There were 3 states in particular, and if memory serves, it's Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, where slaves actually outnumbered whites. And we talked about what happened in Jamaica when slaves outnumbered whites. The slaves overtook and declared their independence. We talked about the same in Haiti, where the slaves rose up and declared their independence. We talked about the same on various ships, and this has happened throughout. So in these 3 states in particular, the whites who were in power there considered slavery important to their way of life and feared the freedom of blacks within their states. And so since Southern states feared an end to slavery because they saw it as an end to their very way of life, Southern states voted together, to the point where in every major political decision involving slavery, every Southern state had the same vote, every Northern state had a different vote. And so, since compromise could not be reached between the North and the South in regards to slavery, the 2 parties could not agree on what to be done. Each group sought to increase their influence and power. The Southerners began to think, how can we increase our influence and power in the legislature? And the North did as well. And the Mexican War proved to be yet another divisive point leading up to the Civil War. Now, Congress passed the Wilmot Proviso, mandating that no territory acquired from the war with Mexico could have slavery. Now, for the North, if these territories did allow slavery, Northerners were concerned that would create more slave states. Number one, this would prohibit work opportunities for people moving into this area. But number 2, it would also limit their power in the legislature. Now, for the South, Southerners viewed slaves as property. And the Constitution protects a person's personal property rights. And so Southerners feared that more slave states would be a restriction on this personal property. And we'll talk about that. In fact, the Supreme Court confirmed at that time that a slave was property and not a person under the Constitution. Now, in 1855, California had reached a sufficient enough population. Remember, we talked about the gold rush and how people just swarmed into California. And so by 1850, there were enough people there for them to apply for statehood. California wanted to be a free state. And the president supported the admission of California as a free state. And Zachary Taylor, president at the time, recommended, who was a Whig, by the way, recommended to the South that slavery be decided by each territory. That was a decision known as popular sovereignty, that slavery could be decided by each territory. Now, as the Senate debated what should be done about slavery, every time it was brought up about a possible end to slavery, Southerners would threaten secession. Secession is a formal withdrawal from a country. A formal withdrawal from the Union. And we've seen Henry Clay several times trying to settle disputes about slavery. Henry Clay offered, who was the Speaker of the House, by the way, offered a compromise called the Compromise of 1850. You see, California wanted to be a free state. Zachary Taylor supported California's decision. He said, perhaps we could avoid war if each territory decides for themselves whether they want to be slave or free. And then the South has no one to secede against because they can only be mad at California if California decides they don't want slaves there. And so Henry Clay offered the Compromise of 1850, and we're going to explore that in the next couple of slides. It was meant to settle the dispute over slavery because Southern states were threatening to leave the Union if California became a free state. Very similar to how many Northerners felt when Missouri wanted to be a slave state. Now, the compromise itself was meant to appease both leaders in the North as well as in the South. California was to be admitted as a free state. This would satisfy Northerners, giving Northern states more influence in the legislature. However, what Southerners feared most was an end to their way of life, an end to the institution of slavery. And so for California to be admitted as a slave state, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed. The Fugitive Slave Act was a more effective slave law. We'll explore it in more detail in just a moment. Meanwhile, the government was to purchase the territory of New Mexico from the new state of Texas. You see, when Texas rebelled against Mexico, and when New Mexico was conquered in the U.S. war with Mexico in 1846, Texas laid claim to the territory of New Mexico. And so one of the provisions here is that New Mexico would become a new state. Another part of the compromise, the slave trade would be banned in Washington, D.C., but that slavery would continue to be permitted. But at this time, it was already becoming very clear that we were on the brink of war. At every turn, the Southerners were threatening secession. At every turn, the Southerners were trying to claim that Northerners were trying to put an end to their way of life. And there was a lot of mutual distrust and a lot of mutual animosity.
After Zachary Taylor died in July of 1850, it became the responsibility of the new president, Millard Fillmore, to make sure the issue of slavery on the newly acquired lands of the Southwest did not tear the nation apart. This task was actually accomplished thanks mostly to the efforts of Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky. He helped put together 5 laws that, when taken together, are known as the Compromise of 1850. These laws were designed to appeal to both sides of the slavery issue, those who wanted to stop its spread into the new American territories, and those who wanted slavery to grow. The people who were against slavery were pleased with the part of the compromise that allowed California to enter the Union as a free state, and also with the law that banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And the people who were for slavery liked the part of the compromise that allowed people living in the new U.S. territories of Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves if they wanted slavery. And the pro-slavery people were very happy with the fugitive slave law part of the compromise, because it forced people in the free states to return escaped slaves to their owners in the South. After he signed the laws of the Compromise of 1850, Millard Fillmore served for a little less than 2 more years as president, and he was not selected to be the Whig candidate in the election of 1852, which saw Franklin Pierce, a Democrat, elected as America's 14th president.
Now, the next major debate that we're going to be looking at, we've already discussed the Hayne-Webster debate. Now we need to talk about John C. Calhoun versus the same Daniel Webster. And if you remember the previous debate, it was a discussion at dinner how Daniel Webster said, "Our Union, it must be preserved." And then, of course, John C. Calhoun stood up at that very same dinner and said, "Our Union next to our liberty most dear." And that was an extreme difference. You know, Webster arguing for the strong central government, the unity of a great nation. And then Calhoun arguing for states' rights, that a state should have the right to nullify a law it disagrees with or considers unconstitutional. That same debate is going to carry over to the Senate floor. It became one of the greatest debates in American history. And many people still carry on this same discussion. You see, John C. Calhoun laid out the Southern case for slavery in the territories. In his view, slaves were property. In his point of view, if slaves were property and the Constitution protects personal property rights, then if slavery were outlawed, then that would be a violation of the Constitution, rendering the government null and void, giving Southern states the right to secede. So this was the legal argument for secession that Calhoun was laying out. And by contrast, we have Daniel Webster, once again, pleading the case for national unity. And so the Calhoun-Webster debate in the Senate is really a continuation of that same Hayne-Webster debate at a dinner. But if you think about an angry argument at a dinner, and now it's being held on the Senate floor. The compromise was eventually adopted. Henry Clay wound up leaving Washington. He retired from politics when the Senate rejected his compromise. He said, I'm done. I'm done trying to make peace. He's been trying to make peace now for 30 years. And he was over it when his final compromise of 1850 was initially rejected. Now, eventually, Stephen Douglas, who we're going to be talking about a lot as well, who's also going to be involved in one of the famous debates in American history, reintroduces the resolutions in a way individually that gets them passed. The new president, Millard Fillmore, gave support. The South eventually agreed to negotiate, and the compromise came into law 9 years after it was introduced. Voted into law in 1859. By the way, secession would occur the next year. So what was meant to preserve the Union, well, it only worked for a few months. So I want you to understand there are two sides to every story. That Southerners viewed Northerners as John Browns. Southerners used a lot of propaganda like this. Of course, we know about John Brown from your essay. He took matters into his own hands. He wanted to free the slaves violently. He not only went into a town in Kansas and started killing slave owners. True story, we'll talk about that soon. But he also went to a weapons compound in Virginia and tried to hand out weapons to slaves. And he was everything that Southerners feared. They called him a terrorist, though we also saw from your document analyzer how Henry David Thoreau of Walden, the Transcendentalist, called him a hero, and how Northern newspapers called him a hero. But this is how Southerners viewed Northerners. But this is what Northerners thought of Southerners. And so really we have a lot of propaganda going on in this divisive time in American history. Southerners were perceived as violent slave owners beating Uncle Tom. You see, a young lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe was 14 when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's amazing, right? What did I do by 14? Not that much. I drove a tractor. Okay, you know. What have we done by 14? Well, we certainly haven't wrote a book to change the world, but hey, we still got time. I wanted to explore Uncle Tom with you just a little bit. You see, Uncle Tom's Cabin, while, you know, the language is archaic, you know, you would find it offensive with some of the racial slurs within the book, and it's not quite culturally appropriate. But for the time, it was powerful, because what it did was humanize a political situation. You see, it's one thing to hear about the evil institution of slavery. It's one thing to hear about the plight of 4 million people. It's quite another to hear someone's story. It's quite another case to take a political issue and make it personal. You see, it's one thing to talk about slavery. It's another to see the scars on a person's back. I don't know if you noticed the famous photograph of the man with the scars from being beaten. We'll look at that again later. Again, it's one thing to talk about 4 million. It's another to talk about an individual and to become connected with their story. And so that's what Uncle Tom did so well. And lastly, I want to look at John Brown with you. And I'm going to close with some of these famous images here. You see, Northerners perceived him as a hero. Southerners wanted to portray him as evil. And it's really a matter of perspective. Through what lens do you want to view this person?